Okay, we'll get going with the May meeting of the 1904 World's Fair Society. Most of you know I'm Mike Truex, but we may have some guests here. But this is the 117th anniversary of the opening of the World's Fair this year, and it's the 35th anniversary of the 1904 World's Fair Society. So tonight we'll have a first-time presentation about the 1900 World's Fair. New member Candace O'Connor wrote a book about Washington University's first 150 years back in 2003. And tonight we'll hear how WashU and the World's Fair were related and inextricably intertwined. But first, I want to know if there's any new members here tonight or any non-members. Down on the bottom, you can either wave with your hand, or there's also a raise your hand button that puts a little yellow hand up in your corner. So if you're a new member or not a member, if you want to raise your hand or wave at us, we want to welcome you to the World's Fair Society meeting. We do this every month. And I only see a couple of names I don't recognize. But, oh, there's Eric Fournier. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that close, but if you want to chat with us a little bit afterwards, we will try to unabashedly recruit you to join the society. And we want to welcome you because we have a lot of fun learning about the fair as we go along. Couple of announcements. Be sure and visit the society website regularly. The website provides the current information about our upcoming meetings. There's also a mail order form for ordering merchandise. And it also has several years worth of pictures if you want to go back and look at what we looked like 4, 5, 6, 8 years or so ago, or how funny we all looked at the banquet. That's kind of fun to do. I do want to make a note, and I'll repeat this a little later, that I think everyone probably just got their May bulletin. And due to a misunderstanding between me and my co-presenter for June and the bulletin, we had an inappropriate date for the June meeting. The June meeting is scheduled for Thursday, June 17th. And your second reminder for this meeting should have had that note in there. Also, be sure and check out the Society's Facebook group page. There have been a lot of other presentations and postings about the World's Fair anniversary at the end of April. Some of them are online, and our next bulletin is going to have an article about how you can find most of those and watch some nice 30-minute videos, one of which Sharon Smith did about a year or so ago, and I think I saw her on here somewhere. I want to thank you for doing that one about opening day, Sharon. I also want to mention our Twitter page that Holly Childress does a great job finding pictures from all over the web and posting a little bit to learn. And they're also getting posted over to our unused page, which is a society page. It's not a group like the big one with 4,000 members, but there's pictures on there also. And I also want to give a special shout out to the members of the society board, and their names are in the bulletin about every 2 or 3 months. We're still having board meetings every month to manage our funds and membership, which currently our bulletin mailing list is 257. And we also plan our future society meeting and events. They deserve your thanks. And I also want to, by name, thank the many members who helped to get these meetings announced, organized, produced, recorded, writing articles about them, getting them into the bulletin, publishing the bulletin, and mailing the bulletin. And those folks include, among others, David Meyer, Holly Childress, Nan Vortreed, Jana Meehan, and Sharon Mercer. So a big shout out and a big thumbs up, and I'm going to raise my hand and wave at them on my screen a little bit with that little yellow thing popping up. So thank you all for all you do. So we'll be heading into our meeting, but I'll mention this again. If you have any questions for our presenter, down at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat room. That is the place to type in your questions for our presenter. And when she gets to the end of her presentation, David will review that and ask the questions of her. So I first, as usual, would like to set the stage for this presentation with what was going on at the World's Fair 117 years ago. Let's go back to Saturday, May 18th, May 18th, 1904. It was a Wednesday. The fair had been open for just over 2 weeks, and more exhibits were being installed and more concessions on the Pike were opening. Special days and building dedications were regularly in the news, with VIPs attending. And I'm going on pause here for about 10 seconds. Restarting my recording. The Canadian Pavilion was dedicated. About 100 newspapermen from Canada attended a reception dedicating the building in its distinctive Henry VII Gothic style. And I got to turn my background. And how many people have ever heard of Henry VII architecture style? That would be the Canadian building. That's what I thought too. But I thought it was worth a picture to share. While there were no major exhibits inside the Canadian Pavilion, they hosted and gave some water and refreshments to anybody. They displayed paintings, they highlighted the Canadian natural resources, and they promoted the free land that Canada was giving away to settlers that emigrated. Local newspapers reported that fair officials received complaints about violators sneaking onto the grounds. Many were climbing the fence near the Pike. The Jefferson Guard escorted all these offenders from the fairgrounds that they could catch. Many attendees were arriving for the World Press Parliament that started tomorrow, and they attended a reception or Congress, which would start tomorrow in Festival Hall. They would meet en masse tomorrow at the first major gathering that was going to take place in Festival Hall. Finally, newspaper report told that a North St. Louis Citizens Association requested that the city install more lights in city parks. The city lighting supervisor, Thomas Carter, refused this request, citing the expense. He also suggested that less light might be nice for sweethearts and spooners. He further said that he didn't think that loving each other in the parks was a serious breach of the peace. Whoa. Okay. So that's the news from 1904, and now it's time to get into our presentation. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Candace O'Connor, and if you do have any comments for her, please enter them into the Zoom comments panel one more time. Candace hails from Rochester, New York, and obtained her degrees in New York. She now lives in University City. She has written 13 books about the history of St. Louis and the Midwest. Most of her books have focused on the landmarks, hospitals, people, and neighborhoods of St. Louis. In 2001, she won a regional Emmy for a documentary about a 1939 sharecropper protest in the Missouri boot heel. She has a new book coming out this fall that will document the history of the former Homer G. Phillips Hospital in St. Louis. So I'm now going to hush up here and turn the screen and microphone over to Candace. Candace O'Connor.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, and thanks to everybody for inviting me. Mike has been very, very helpful, I must say. I wasn't that familiar with the intricacies of how to do a Zoom presentation using slides, so he has been a great tutor in all of this, so I really have appreciated it. I must say, I don't know most of you, but you are a daunting crowd in some ways. I mean, I think of Mike, who knows everything about the World's Fair, and there are probably a lot of you who are like that. And then I noticed that Esley Hamilton is here and he knows everything about everything. So so this is a tough crowd here, but I Mike asked me to begin by saying a word or two about my own relationship to the university and to the World's Fair. The university part is easy. My husband and I live only 4 blocks from campus, and he was the dean of University College there for many years until he retired. I wrote Washington University's history some years ago, and I've written books about various departments and hospitals associated with the School of Medicine. And as far as the World's Fair goes, my great aunt Matilda paid a visit to the fair, and she left me some items from her trip. So I have to show you these. This is one little treasure of mine. I'm sure you have many other treasures. This, I'm not sure which exhibit this came from, but it's a cute little purse, a beaded bag. And this is a little, must have been from the Alaska building, because this is, it says Sitka on the top.
Could you hold that first one back up a second, Candace? I want to
Sure.
get, no, the first little purse thing, or is that it? Oh,
This is it, yeah.
okay. Got it, thanks.
Sure, sure. My St. Louis grandmother was also there, and I have 2 little items that she bought there also. One is the Palace of Transportation, and just a little St. Louis item too. So I'm sure you all have many more treasures than I do, but I'll show you the 2 books that I wrote that deal with the World's Fair to some extent. This is a book I wrote, A History of the Central West End, which has a lot of information about the fair and about, of course, the neighborhood. And this is the Washington University history that I wrote. Gosh, it must be 16 years ago now, but this is the history of the university. And it has a whole section on WashU and the World's Fair. So back to the presentation. Let me see if I can pull up my slides here. Okay. Let's see now. Does that do it? Does that look okay, Mike?
Looks good to me.
Okay, great. You may wonder why I've used these unusual colors in my opening slide. The reason is that red and green are Washington University's colors. But in the era we'll be discussing, they were often described as myrtle, the green, and maroon. Students were extremely proud of these school colors. In 1916, someone made a silent film called The Maid of Macmillan. Now, you may know that Macmillan was the women's dormitory. And this film featured a young male student whose name was Jack Tower, and Tower was the men's dorm. Young Jack fell in love with a female student, and her name was, can you guess? Her name was Myrtle Maroon. Okay. So back to our subject for the evening. Let me give away the punchline immediately. There was no shortage of connections between Washington University and the World's Fair. There were just dozens of them, large and small. And I'm going to tell you about many of them. The university leased space and key buildings to the fair, increasing its available acreage from 657 to 766, plus other nearby tracts that brought the total to 1,272 acres. Unfortunately, the fair did cause a little resentment among the students at the beginning because they were impatient to move to their glorious new campus, but the fair prevented them from moving as soon as they would like. But still, that didn't stop them from being frequent visitors to the fair, especially the Pike. Faculty members were also involved designing some of the buildings, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So were alumni who cleaned up the city's murky water before the big event and served as directors for the fair itself. And remember that our David Francis, the leader of the entire fair effort, was a loyal university alum twice over. Now let's look in detail at the fair and university relationship. We'll start by going back into the late 19th century and an early classic professor named Sylvester Waterhouse. He was a bachelor and wholly dedicated to the university. When he died, he left the university his entire estate, $25,000. And incidentally, this was called the Sleeping Beauty Endowment because even though he was a classics professor and not economics, he was a very clever guy. And he stipulated in his will that the university invest that $25,000 and leave it untouched for 100 years, hence the Sleeping Beauty reference. And then after the 100 years was up, he stipulated they could only use whatever they had that was above $1 million. And the rest of it had to be reinvested for another 100 years. It's funny because when I was working on the Washington University history, I told that story. And that was one of the only things they said to me. Oh, please don't include that, Candace. We don't want any other alums to do that. We don't want anyone to have any more Sleeping Beauty endowments. But actually, they let me put it in anyway. But in addition to Washington University, Waterhouse also loved St. Louis. In 1893, he had visited the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and soon he was ardently promoting the idea of a grand exposition held in St. Louis to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase. That event, he wrote, was a milestone in American history equal to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and it deserved a giant celebration. Among other things, he said, it would make the name of St. Louis known over all the world. So he publicized these views rather widely, and it's unclear how many people were influenced by him, but at least he was an early spokesman for a World's Fair. By 1900, Washington University was not quite 50 years old. I'm going to go back into the early history of the university so you can see where it was before the fair began. The university had been founded by a pair of men who were friends and mutual admirers. One of them was Wayman Crow, shown here, a self-made man who was building a very successful dry goods business in St. Louis. He was also a member of the growing Church of the Messiah, which was a Unitarian church, and a large one at that. It had more than 1,500 members, I think. Oops. Why is it not? Oh my goodness, Mike, somehow it's not moving here. Let's see.
I'm Yvonne.
This is our next slide. So the pastor of Wayman Crow's church was the Reverend William Greenleaf Eliot. He was a small man, but he had a giant social conscience. On a visit to St. Louis, Ralph Waldo Emerson had met Eliot and called him the Saint of the West. Does anyone know who his grandson was? Just raise your hand if you do, I'd be curious. Oh, somebody does. Justin does, I guess. Okay. And maybe some others too. His grandson was
T.S. Eliot.
Yes, right. Yes. Very good. T.S. Eliot. Yeah, T.S. Eliot was his grandson. But William Greenleaf Eliot was also a man with big ideas for education. And his congregation knew that. I mean, he was, that was his great calling in life. But he loved education. He worked with the St. Louis public schools. He founded schools for the underprivileged, but he just loved education. That was a sort of secondary mission of his. So in February 1853, that Wayman Crow you just saw, who was a state senator, decided to act. He sent a letter to Eliot that contained a postscript. Okay, I don't know if you can read this very well, but I'll tell you what it says. So this is from Crow to Eliot. it tells Eliot, who had no idea about any of this, that Crow had just done something remarkable. He managed to pass through the state Senate an act of incorporation for a new school, a new university called Eliot Seminary. So as not to startle Eliot too much, Crow added that this institution could only be partially organized and held in reserve. I mean, you could put it off for a while. You didn't have to act on it right away. And Eliot wrote in his journal that an Eliot Seminary has been incorporated by the present legislature, but I know nothing of it. So this was a total surprise for Eliot. And he was an extremely modest man, and he quickly quashed the idea that it was going to be called Eliot Seminary. No, nothing named for him, no way. So he instead proposed Washington University, because that would be named for George Washington, who was a figure everybody he felt could admire. So, but Eliot being Eliot, this charter did not languish for very long. He just couldn't resist. Only by 30 years later, only 3 decades later, a large campus had developed in downtown St. Louis with his main buildings at 17th and Washington. Now you can take a second here and look at these buildings and read the key down below and see what was what. The major cluster of academic buildings was right at 17th and Washington. You can see the 1 through 5, which are the main school, the main university. But then there are the secondary divisions are 6 and 7, and then 10 also, which is Mary Institute. And then there's medical and law school as well, and you can see those. And that area, in case you don't quite know where that is today, that area is roughly in the same area as the City Museum downtown. Okay, so let's take a closer look at some of these buildings. Okay. This is Academic Hall, which was the first building at Washington University. It was completed in 1856. It was followed by a small chemistry laboratory. Now see these young men who are doing their experiments here. And you can see that they also have rock samples in the cupboards, and they had quite a wonderful geological collection also. And then soon thereafter, Eliot was able to build the larger, more elegant University Hall in 1871. But sadly, none of these buildings that I'm showing you exist today. They've all been torn down. And I think that the only thing you can see in that area right now is a plaque that's on a wall of one of the existing buildings down there that says, you know, Washington University once stood here. So see these students hard at work in their classes. You might also note 2 things. These students, for one thing, are all men. The first woman student was only admitted in 1870. And for some years, women just trickled into the university. Also note that this room is very dark and not appealing. I mean, if you were a student, would you want to be in this kind of dark, forbidding room? But keep that point in mind for a second, because that's going to come back in a minute. Okay. Soon the fledgling school also managed to build a small observatory with a donated telescope. And they had a really noted astronomer on staff, Henry Pritchett, who was just a marvelous astronomer. So for their size, the school had people like Henry Pritchett, Sylvester Waterhouse, and they were wonderful faculty members. Now, this is one of the secondary divisions of the university. This is Smith Academy, which was this high school for boys. It was considered kind of a feeder school for the university. And this is a place where T.S. Eliot went to school. He went to Smith Academy before going off to Harvard. The other secondary divisions, as I mentioned, are the Manual Training School, which I'll show you in a second. There it is. Okay, this taught skills to students. And then there was also, Mary Institute, as we discussed. So remember that it also had a very good law school. This is the downtown campus of the law school. Look at all those law books. And the school even had a wonderful art museum that was donated by that same Wayman Crow we saw earlier to honor his son, who had died very young. His son was a budding artist. And so Wayman Crow gave a large amount of money to build a downtown art museum that was apparently lavish and really beautiful. But by the late 19th century, so at the time when that map was made that I showed you, the school was really in trouble. Eliot, who had gone on to become the university's third chancellor, had died in 1887, leaving a huge void. I mean, he was the life and breath of the school for so many years. And he's the one who had raised all the money and gotten people excited about it. But his loyal parishioners from that Unitarian church, who had generously supported the school through the years, like Wayman Crow, or like James Smith, who gave the money for Smith Academy, were also gone. So the school was really in very, very precarious condition by the end of the 19th century. But just then, a kind of miracle occurred that saved the teetering school. Now this man, who joined the board in 1891, was Samuel Cupples. You may have heard of him. His house is still on the SLU campus, and it's well worth visiting when you can. He was the founder and proprietor of an enormously profitable woodenware and paper goods business. And he was also a member of the Washington University board. So in the late 19th century, Cupples saw what was happening to the school, and he was concerned about it. So he convinced his business partner, who was kind of a surrogate son. I mean, he didn't have any sons himself. And so Robert Summers Brookings kind of not only became his partner, but also his son, in effect. And they often collaborated on philanthropic things. They both collaborated to give the Cupples warehouses to the university, which was an enormous financial boost. So Cupples convinced Robert Brookings to become a board member, which was the best thing that could have happened to the university. Brookings was then a dapper bachelor. He never actually married until he was 77 years old. He was also wealthy and restless. He was looking for a cause. And somehow the cause of Washington University really appealed to him. He had never had much education himself. He really felt that that lack of education bitterly. So having as of history was enormously appealing to him. In 1895, he became president of the Washington University Board, which they then called not the board, but they called it the corporation. So he became president of the corporation. And from that point on, the university's future became his life's mission. He was a cutthroat negotiator. He had been, when he worked with Samuel Cupples, he was the traveling salesman, and he would go west and he would sell and sell, and he would undercut his competitors, and he would put them out of business. And I mean, he looked like a mild-mannered man, but he was very, very astute and very shrewd businessman. So he worked out the very favorable lease agreement with the fair that called for a rental price of $650,000, plus another $100,000 if the fair was a year late, which of course it was. Now this is Brookings' home. It's really a majestic looking place. I've never been inside it, but it's still at 5125 Lindell, so you can drive past it and take a look at it. Brookings knew that the university needed a new campus away from the increasingly smoky and dirty downtown area. Remember that dark classroom that I pointed out to you these students really, really wanted more light and air. I mean, they were tired of the smoke. They were tired of the noise because trucks and, well, not so much trucks, but vehicles were going past, heavy vehicles, and the noise really resonated inside the building. So they were eager to get out of the city. So how did Robert Brookings find the new location for the university? Well, after his death, his widow, Robert Brookings' widow, the woman he had married when he was 77, hired a biographer who was a former PR man named Herman Hagedorn. Herman Hagedorn approached this biography as a work of fiction, I think, because he said that with a touch of imagination, that Brookings had ridden his gallant horse up a hill along Skinker Boulevard west of Forest Park. There he found some farmland, fell in love with its commanding position, and decided that it would be ideal for his new campus. In fact, according to this writer, he actually said out loud at that point, "It can be like the Acropolis if only they will see." Well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but the real story is much more boring. It was a committee that actually identified the site. And one of the people on the committee was one of William Greenleaf Eliot's sons, Henry Ware Eliot, who was a brick manufacturer in St. Louis.
Come on.
Okay, so here's an 1899 rendering of what the relocated school would look like. By then, Brookings also had the money to make it happen. Not only did he give substantially of his own money, but he had wealthy friends. And believe me, he didn't scruple to tap each one of them to ask them for money too. And not only that, but there's something really sneaky that he did as time went on. I told you he was a bachelor and he was considered extremely eligible. So he would go to wealthy widows and he would hang out with these wealthy widows and they would want to ingratiate themselves with Robert Brookings. So they would give money for a new building in honor of their late husbands. And then he would go on to the next widow. So I'm afraid he led some widows down the garden path here. But anyway, he promised $200,000 himself for the administration building. And his friends pledged large sums for other buildings. He got $100,000 from Adolphus Busch for a new chemistry building. Another $100,000 each from Stephen Ridgley for a new library, and from Elizabeth Liggett for a men's dormitory. And he got double that, $250,000 from his dear friend Samuel Cupples for 2 engineering buildings. And you can see some of them in this picture. I mean, this is a rendition of what the campus could look like, but certainly you can pick out the administration building down here. Just behind it, across the quadrangle, is the Ridgley Library. To the left is Busch Hall, and to the right are the Cupples buildings. Now I'm going to show you some construction shots of the new campus and the workers who built it. And these are shots that you don't see very often, but I got them from the university archives. So we'll go through them. I have probably a dozen of them here to show you. So see if you can see all the equipment and rather primitive equipment that went into building these first buildings. And also note, as you can, I guess, look in the distance at the very top of the photograph. You can see the developed area, which is the Central West End, beyond the fields. You can see that that's the end of the city. We're into the farmland here. In fact, the site of the university was, an old corn acreage. So here's some of the grading they did. And I will tell you that, that this grading project was the most significant ever undertaken in St. Louis at that time. It was just, I don't think you overstated it. It was just enormous. It involved moving nearly 1 million cubic yards of earth. The present level of the main quad required a 12-foot fill. Can you imagine? Originally, it was 12 feet lower than it is now. The original level of Liggett Hall, for example, was 25 to 30 feet below its eventual grade. So this was a tremendous earth moving project. So here's one of the foundations of one of the new buildings. In some of these shots, you can see some of the original farm buildings, as well as buildings that the construction crews have put up for their own uses. So they weren't using tractors, and they weren't using, any kind of graders or anything else that we could use today that would have made this job easier. You can see the horses, the mules, the men, and look how dirty they are. This was very dirty work indeed. Now here's Brookings, which was then called the administration building, later known as Brookings Hall. This is Brookings being built. Isn't it hard to imagine Brookings not being there? It sort of seems like a building that was there from the beginning of time. Okay, here's another shot of Brookings. Again, you can see the developed area out beyond, and look at these poor horses doing all that work too. Now here's one of the fields from 1900. So you can see it had very recently been farmland. This was not very long ago at all. I don't know if you can see here. I'm not sure if that's a barn or what that is over to the right, but in some of these shots, you can see original barns that they were tearing down. Okay, here's Brookings again. It looks like they were putting in power to the site, building up stone. This project really involved lots and lots of stone cutters, stone masons. I mean, just a huge crew of people who knew how to do stonework. Okay, here's Busch Construction. This is Busch Hall, the one I mentioned that Adolphus Busch gave. And now it's going up with the signature pink granite of the university. Okay, here's some of the stone cutters and hard at work. And just imagine what it was like for them too in the hot St. Louis summer doing this extremely dusty and difficult work. Another shot of the stone cutter shop. It looks to me like these are largely younger men too who are doing this, and no wonder given the difficulty. Hello. Now here's Brookings again going up. As I've gone through these shots, I've seen that the men who worked on this didn't seem to have any fear of falling. I mean, they would walk across a very skinny little walls, and they'd walk at a height. There was no safety wire or anything of that kind. They just did it. Here's one of Samuel Cupples' buildings going up, Cupples One. And here's this kind of reminds me of a childhood book I had, Mike Mulligan and his steam shop, kind of looked at that steam shop. Okay, here's Cupples Two, the other building that Samuel Cupples gave. That's going up here too. You see they're very consistent. Cope and Stewardson was the architectural team, and Brookings had wanted a design that reminded him of Princeton, of Bryn Mawr, and he got what he wanted in Cope and Stewardson. Okay, here's Cupples Two. I was curious as to whether this man was African American. I can't really tell from the picture. I would think it was a racially diverse crew, but I'm not certain of that. So here's the construction crew, the whole lot of them. So have a look. These are the folks who made WashU University possible. Okay, so this is the doorway to Brookings. And it really, things are really coming into shape now. So let me show you some of the completed buildings now that we've seen them, in the midst of construction. Probably everyone here knows that the first 5 university buildings on the Hilltop campus, which, as I said, were largely financed by Brookings and his friends, were leased to the fair. And here's a picture that Mike found for us, the administration building. By the way, it was, as I said, it was later renamed Brookings Hall, but that was not Brookings's idea. Like William Greenleaf Eliot, he was staunchly opposed to having his name used, at least initially, because he said he couldn't ask people for money to construct a building named for himself. It just couldn't happen. So inside the administration building, this picture, as you can see, has been damaged somewhat, but you can still get a sense of the David Francis's office in here. Adjoining this was a bar room, room 220. His office was room 200. And the walls of the bar room were marked with dirty streaks. They were scratches left by smokers who were impatient to light their old-fashioned parlor matches. So they would just light them on the wall, leaving a dirty streak. And those guests also imbibed plenty of alcohol. One early historian at the university said that the whole southern end of the administration building smelled like champagne for more than a year after the fair ended. So, okay, this is Busch Hall, as we talked. Now, Adolphus, who had given the money for it, as you probably have guessed, was the co-founder of Anheuser-Busch Brewery. And this building was used for architects and engineers employed by the fair. There was also Liggett, which I mentioned was given by Elizabeth Liggett, which held fair guests. And incidentally, Liggett Hall, later known as Prince Hall, is the only one of these early university buildings that's been demolished. The rest of them still stand. And that demolition of Liggett was controversial, but it did take place. Remember Samuel Cupples? Here is Cupples One, which held ethnological exhibits of the US government, while Cupples Two had the headquarters and dormitory for the fair's private police force, the Jefferson Guards. Here's another look at Cupples One. You also know, I'm sure, that with the lease income and the funds from the individual donors, Brookings then was able to construct 4 more buildings, which were also used for the fair. Tower Hall, which was later called Lee and then Umrath, used as a dormitory for out-of-town students. And also Eads Hall, which was largely funded by the daughter of James Eads. Do you remember him? James Eads was the Eads Bridge guy, but he also built the ironclads for the Union Army during the Civil War. This was the headquarters for women's organizations. I'm not sure why this is so jolly. I'm sorry it's such a bad picture, but Ridgley Library is where social events were held, and a magnificent display of Queen Victoria's diamonds was on the 2nd floor. Its main reading room was used partly for social events, such as a ball given by the West Point cadets. And then Holmes Lounge was also used, particularly toward the end of the fair, for various congresses, scientific congresses, and this is one of them. The last new building was the David R. Francis Gymnasium, and it was outfitted as a model gym by the Spalding Company. And the university managed to retain that elaborate sports equipment after the fair, which was a great help to them. This gym was also closely allied to another event on campus shown here, which I'll only mention very briefly here. It was the 1904 Olympics. Now, Mike Truax can tell you some stories about some of these runners, especially the guy who's wearing pants there, but that's maybe for another time.
I think we'll have an Olympic program in July, I hope.
Great, great. So remember that the campus was also home to other buildings from the fair, such as Great Britain's replica of Queen Anne's Orangery at Kensington Gardens. It was the only one that of the foreign buildings that was preserved after the fair. It became the temporary home of the School of Fine Arts until Bixby Hall was completed in 1926. And we'll talk about Bixby in a minute. Another of the foreign buildings was the Italian Pavilion, shown here. And there were others too. Now, I don't know these pictures nearly as well as Mike does, so I'm going to turn you over to him just for a second so he can identify some of them. Now, you do see in the upper left, you see Brookings, or the administration building. So sort of, anchor yourself there on the administration building, and Mike will take you from there to some of the other foreign buildings.
Okay, Candace, if you can kind of circle your mouse up where Washington University is.
Oops, I'm sorry. I'm trying, but it's not cooperating here. Mike, you might have to do without my mouse here.
Okay, I'll make it a little harder. In the upper left dark building, you can see the administration building, Brookings Hall, and the quadrangle of WashU. Just below that are two domes. The taller, skinnier dome is the Brazil building, and the one to its right is the massive Belgium building that went down and was used at the brewery for a number of years. If you go straight up from Belgium, up just before you get to the horizon, it's kind of hard to see, but you can actually see a tall 6-story building, and you probably can't tell that it's octagonal, but that's University City Hall. So below Brazil and Belgium is the French Pavilion with its large garden area between the building and the road. And that road, by the way, looking up to the north is Skinker Boulevard. Just north of the garden area, you can see Siam and a couple other buildings. And then there's the orange area that Candace mentioned. And the top building on the fairgrounds on the right near the edge of the picture is Hale's Firefighters at the western end of the Pike. And then just below that is New York to the North Pole, another major Pike concession. And this picture, if you haven't figured it out yet, is taken from the Ferris wheel near the very top of the Ferris wheel, looking slightly west north.
And you can also see some of those power poles that we saw in the construction shots that were just being put up. You can see them all over the place here. Thanks, Mike. Thank you for elaborating on that. Okay, this is the China Pavilion. You probably know the story of Prince Pu Lun, who enjoyed himself so much when he came to visit that he stayed for 2 months. This was copied from his summer palace, and it was created from more than 6,000 pieces of wood and decorative elements, including ivory inlaid panels, which sounds fabulous. I also found, I think when I was writing the WashU book, that some of those panels wound up in the possession of Washington University and were stored in Graham Chapel basement for years until some faculty member bought them all for $200. I never could find out who the faculty member was, but I thought, what a deal. Okay. So those are the initial buildings. And there's one more site that I haven't mentioned, and that is an aeronautics zone in which Santos Dumont, the famous Brazilian aeronaut, gave exhibitions of his primitive flying machine. This is not Santos Dumont, but it is aeronaut Roy Knabenshue taking off. He flew T.S. Baldwin's California Aero for about an hour to about 2,000 feet and managed somehow to land where he took off. I'm just surprised he survived it all, but he managed to land. Now, Mike is going to tell us one quick story here about Knabenshue, which he told me and I thought great. So Mike, go ahead.
Well, Roy Knabenshue had 2 unsuccessful flights where he took off with power, but something happened with the engine and he was forced to come back, or the valve cover fell off and he went floating a couple miles away. And on one occasion, when the airship had floated away, they drove in a car to go get it. And there were three guys tied to the lower part, and they're dragging this balloon. It's still elevated off the ground. Apparently they had to throw the ropes over some trolley lines. And when they did, the ropes slipped and the thing flew off again. Well, it flew about 6 or 7 miles west and it landed out along 64 and where 64 and Clayton is. I'm not sure of this restaurant, but I think it was Lester's near where it landed. The name of the farmland and who owned the farmland where it landed is noted in some of the books. But I've heard the story that that restaurant that's there for many, many decades served a drink called the Knabenshue.
That's great. Thank you. I see Yvonne raising her hand.
Yep, go ahead, Yvonne.
The restaurant is Bush's Grove, not Lester's. And,
Okay.
it's at the corner of Clayton and Price Road, and the building is still there, but it's no longer a restaurant. In fact, I think it's still currently unused, but the restaurant has not been open for quite a few years.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Well, now that we have seen Washington University being constructed and built up, let's just see a few photos of what was happening just across the street from the new campus. Visitors to the new campus, and there were many of them, were also seeing these changes, keep in mind. They were seeing the massive cutting down of 40,000 old trees. As one writer put it, seldom has there been a more desolate sight than was presented by the acres and acres of stumps before the stately fair buildings replaced them. Here's another shot of what was happening before the World's Fair. You had old spaces, old buildings that were quickly being replaced. Another shot of that. Another Forest Park shot. So just think of how different Forest Park was much of it was coming to look. Not all of it, but much of it. So now there were new buildings, exciting new buildings in a formerly quiet place, and there were glorious new buildings. You probably know this part of the story better than I do, so I won't go on about the fair, but these are the kinds of things people were watching go up. All these wonderful buildings. It must have been so exciting. Okay. But the relationships with the fair extended far beyond the spaces themselves. Washington University students, much as they regretted not coming to the new campus, patronized the fair and even worked for it. They especially loved the exciting Pike along the fair's northern edge. They even borrowed its name for their athletic teams, which they called the Pikers. And if you read the student publications at the university, as I have, you'll find lots of references to the Pike. For example, one student wrote in 1904, "I stood on the Pike at 8:30. I was broke as broke could be, and I looked for some kind-hearted manager to hand out a pass to me." They're looking for freebies. Okay. They also love to make harmless jokes about the fair. Like, here's one. "Where is the best place to hold the World's Fair?" asked one student. And the answer was, "Around the waist." Get it? The World's Fair. Okay. Okay. And not only students, but faculty were also a key part of the fair. Architect Louis Spearing, a member of the faculty from 1903 to 1911, designed bridges, colonnades, gardens, and even buildings, including the Palais de Costume and the Horticulture Building. Now, this is a picture of the Horticulture Building shown on the page of a wonderful scrapbook, which I'm sure you've heard about. It was compiled by a young girl, Adele Quinet, later Phelps, who was one of the fair's most devoted visitors. Her scrapbook was recently donated to the Missouri History Museum by the Phelps family. And they're so excited to have it. It's just wonderful. Here is Halsey Ives, director of the university's School of Fine Arts, who was also Fine Arts chief at the fair. And for the fair's sculpture division, Ives hired George Julian Zolnay, shown here later sculpting David Francis. Zolnay later became an art faculty member at the university. Let's move on to university alumni who took part in the fair. There are far too many to cover them all today, but here's one of them, architect William Eames, who designed the much acclaimed Education Palace. Another talented group of alums performed an invaluable service, not only for the fair, but for the entire city. You know, I'm sure that St. Louis was noted for its sediment-heavy water, in other words, dirty water. Mark Twain once described the Missouri River water as too thick to drink, too thin to plow. And really the same thing was true of the Mississippi River water, particularly when the river was at flood stage in spring and early summer. And this chocolate colored water also correlated with the city's high rate of typhoid disease. But two engineering graduates from the university, Edward Flad and Silas Bent Russell, joined this man, John Wixford, a chemistry graduate, and some other alums to clean up the city's water supply. At the 1905 commencement, one speaker said, "To the modest and retiring Wixford, the city of St. Louis should erect a statue of crystal to typify the bright water which has evolved for the turbid stream that flows by us." Washington University board members were also involved in the fair from big ways to small. Remember Samuel Cupples again. Here is a fair postcard. See whether you can read the very fine print at the lower left. Can you see it? It says Samuel Cupples Envelope Company. So the fair was using Samuel Cupples services. I don't know if they were free or if they were donated or if they had to pay, but in any event, this is a Samuel Cupples postcard. This is a blurry picture. I'm sorry about that, but it didn't expand very well. Some prominent men in St. Louis had even more direct board connections. Alfred Lee Shapley, A.L. Shapley, a Smith Academy and WashU graduate, was one of the 118 board members for the Louisiana Purchase, and he was a board member at Washington University, serving on the university's board for 50 years. And there were quite a few who overlapped between the two boards. Here is George Warren Brown, a successful shoe manufacturer, who was also a fair board member and also served on the university's board. If his name sounds familiar to you, that may be because after he died, his widow endowed the university's George Warren Brown School of Social Work in his memory, and then also built a fine social work building to honor him. Let me add that there were many other men who were serving or had served on the WashU board as well as the LPE board, but that is not all. Some of the names such as Samuel Kennard are familiar because they served as executors of the Robert Barnes Trust, which became the core of Barnes Hospital. Elias Michael's wife was on the board of lady managers of St. Louis Children's Hospital, and others were prominent in the efforts to found and finance the WashU School of Medicine. Of course, the most famous crossover figure who brought the university and the fair together was David Francis himself. He was widely known as Our Dave, and here he is with the famous son of Missouri, Mark Twain. Francis lived with his wife and 6 sons in a giant house no longer standing in the Central West End. You probably know he did just about everything in his career, serving as St. Louis mayor, Missouri governor, Secretary of the Interior, and finally, after the fair, as ambassador to Russia. But at the fair, which he threw himself into heart and soul, was, as he said in a speech on closing day, the work of my life. He hobnobbed with presidents and princes both during and after the fair, when he made a celebratory trip to thank all the heads of state who had helped. Here is what his biographer Harper Barnes said of him. David R. Francis was a brash, opinionated, stubborn, smart, sometimes foolish, straight-talking, quick-acting, independent-minded, proud, self-made man. Along with the fair, the other great love of his public life was Washington University. He graduated from with his bachelor's degree in 1870 when he was only 20 years old, and later with his law degree. When he spoke at the university's 1905 commencement, and you can see him up front here. Do you see him in the front row of those four gentlemen in top hats? He recalled the recently concluded fair across the street and two of his monuments, the Peace Statue and the Victory Statue. And here's what he said in 1905. Those are the figures that symbolize the scope and the achievements of man, he said. Peace and victory, a victory of peace. Let us transfer, in our imagination at least, victory and peace to the towers of the administration building that mark the grand entrance to the university quadrangle, there to remain for another 100 years. What great oratory. Huh? So that's one of the key figures, but I have two more to tell you about quickly. Let's see, this is another group that I think has, let's see, where is he? David Francis is in here somewhere. Maybe some of you can pick him out. But the next figure that I want to talk about was this man, William Bixby, the wealthiest man in St. Louis. In the 1920s, he donated some $250,000 toward a new fine arts building to the refounded university. But that was only one piece of his largesse. He also gave his autograph collection. You've seen on campus probably statues of his favorite Scottish poet, Bobby Burns, and he gave much more at the medical school. Further, he served on the university's board as Brookings vice president. Of course, he was also one of the board members for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition and head of its Fine Arts Commission. Here he is later. You see him on the extreme left with David Francis in the middle. This photo, by the way, was from the dedication of the Jefferson Memorial, which, as I'm sure you know, was built with funds from the fair. And that, by the way, on the extreme right is Samuel Kennard, whom I mentioned. He was the man chiefly responsible for taking the Bixby money, the Bixby $800,000, and kind of reinvesting it and building it until he had enough to really build the kind of hospital that Bixby had wanted. This is one of the homes that he lived in, that Bixby lived in. This was on Portland Place. But that wasn't the biggest one that he and his wife and their 6 sons lived in. At one point, they lived on the block where the Chase Park Plaza stands now. They owned the entire block where the Chase Park Plaza is, in a gigantic mansion, and this is just the facade. Believe it or not, someone else had built it, but he bought it and made it even more elaborate. Here's the house itself, which he bought a year before his retirement from the American Car and Foundry Company at age 48. I guess being able to retire at 48 was pretty nice. I think you may be able to see the apartment building beyond it, which is the St. Regis Apartments today. This mansion contained gorgeous spaces inside, such as this entryway area. I don't know how many servants they had, but look how the wood glistens. Oh, it's just absolutely gorgeous. Bixby used part of this mansion for his extraordinary art collection, some of which went to Washington University and some to the St. Louis Art Museum. But now I have to tell you one last story about Bixby. This is one last little known item that shows how connected Bixby was, not just with the university, but with the fair. You might think that his giant house in St. Louis was enough real estate for one man, but it wasn't. His wife hailed from the Adirondacks in New York State near Lake George, and he decided to build a summer home along that lake. His granddaughter, Sally Bixby Defty, you may remember her she used to work for the newspaper here, and other grandchildren live on that property today. and I visited Sally a few years back to tour the site. One thing they showed me with pride was this boathouse down here. You can see it down on the water, which contained this beautiful electric wooden boat called, as you can see, maybe the St. Louis. The story was that Bixby had been scouting in Chicago for items to display at the fair, something new and different, when he came across this launch and he bought it for himself. Today, his family still enjoys using it. There's even a sign-up sheet in the boathouse, complete with a warning. It says, "Please feel free to use this boat, but you must turn on the bilge pumps. If you do not, and the boat should sink, you will be required to join the French Foreign Legion." So that completes our whirlwind tour of Washington University and the fair. For both parties, the coincidence of their proximity was a great benefit. In 1905, Francis wrote in the student publication that the campus had appreciated and valued, and the improvements made during the fair would remain. But he also added this: the university was now permanently photographed on the memories of many millions of World's Fair visitors from all parts of the Union and from all parts of the world. He said that the fair had done that, and indeed it had. So that's the end, and I'd be happy to have any questions you might have. Thank you.
David, you got any questions that have been entered?
There you go. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Let's see.
While we're waiting, I got a note from Sharon Smith, who said she had to run soon, but glad to see this. Great photographs. Give Candace my regards. She may remember me from her days at Missouri Historical Society.
Indeed, I do. Hi, Sharon. Nice to hear from you again.
Candace?
Yes. Hi, Linda.
Hi there. One of the stories about Sam Cupples and leaving his warehouses and his home right in the middle of SLU's campus to Washington University instead of St. Louis University was that he had the property first where the home is, and then SLU kept buying up properties, and they built right between him, Cupples, and his warehouses.
Oh.
They built Busch Hall, which is maybe 8 stories tall. And so Sam Cupples could no longer stand at his windows and see his warehouses downtown.
Oh.
And that made him mad. And in his will, he left those things then to Washington University with the stipulation that the Jesuits never get their hands on the house and any of the property.
Oh,
And
great.
so the house, when he died, his niece lived there for a little while, but then it was sold to the Railroad Telegraphers Union.
Oh.
And they eventually, after 20 years, didn't want it. And so they broke the will and did sell it to SLU. So now Cupples' house belongs to SLU, and they used it as their student union for a while. And now, of course, it's a historic home
Yes.
to be preserved and toured. Yeah.
Well, how nice. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Okay.
Gosh. Oh,
Questions? I have a question for Candace. Candace, if you'd start your screen share up again, and
Okay.
if you can find and go back to the, I think it was slide number 29, which was the 1899 aerial view of the campus.
Okay, sure. Just a second here. I'm sorry, I just got out of it. I
Yeah.
didn't know we needed it again. Okay. Okay, let me get back in. Okay, gotcha. Is it slide 29? Okay. Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's kind of full screen. You'll have to go back about 3/4 of the way. I don't know if there's a way to easily do that in Keynote. Oh, there you go.
Okay, I'm sorry, it was 29.
29, scroll up quite a bit.
Okay, let's see, that's one. But sorry, you wanted something different. Okay.
It was the aerial view, 1899. I thought it was 29.
Here it's 22. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, 22. Okay. So my question for you is, obviously Forsyth is on the upper left, going diagonally into the distance.
Yes.
And what is now Forest Park Parkway is to the right of that. And the quadrangle with the traffic circle going up the hill is right near the bottom. But I'm curious as to, I think we know that Skinker is a pretty good ways from that traffic circle and the quadrangle. And is there some land that was left kind of vacant or not shown in this drawing between that street where the circle is and off screen where Skinker would be? Because I don't think that's Skinker.
So it's not to scale, you're saying. It might be sort of truncated a little bit. That may be.
No, can I,
Oh, Esley,
Cut
please,
off.
please,
Esley.
please.
they just cut off the eastern part of the campus, and nothing was built there until Bixby Hall was built in the 20s. And that at that time, there was a huge debate about the style of Bixby, whether it should be collegiate Gothic or classical. And the head of the architecture school wanted the classical because he had been trained in the École des Beaux-Arts, whereas not Brookings, but Jameson, who was the representative of Cope and Stewardson in St. Louis, he was arguing for the collegiate Gothic, but he lost.
Esley, who else did? Brookings was looking at Princeton and Bryn Mawr, but there were some other places too, weren't there?
The University of Pennsylvania
Right.
campus itself, all three of those had major buildings by Cope and Stewardson. already.
Yeah.
But competition also.
Mhm.
And this was the only irregular campus that was proposed among the 6 competitors. The others all were formal with matching buildings on either side of an extensive linear quadrangle. And the judges were reluctant to accept any of those because that meant that they'd have to raise money for 2 buildings to keep the campus symmetrical. And whereas with an asymmetrical plan, they would only have to build one at a time.
There you go. In the book that I did, I included pictures of what some of the other, I don't know if you could see this at all, but what some of the other architects wanted to do. I mean, Brookings did have other architects make designs, and I guess you probably can't see it really well, but there were some very different designs from the Cope and Stewardson. There was McKim, Mead, and White. There was a colonnaded design. There was a French Renaissance style by Carrere and Hastings, and there was a cast Gilbert elevation, which I think Buford Pickens said was unquestionably the most skillful reworking of Olmsted's site plan in the competition. But and I kind of like that one, but Robert Brookings chose Cope and Stewardson.
Yeah. Well, once they built Eads, they couldn't build the second quadrangle that you see in this drawing because the Eads Hall sticks right out into that area. But they could have made tighter quadrangles going west than they did. That after the original quadrangle, they pretty much just sprinkled the buildings along that plateau that you mentioned they constructed in the grading process.
Yes, yeah.
Wasn't Cass Gilbert's idea to build the quadrangle that we know now, pattern almost identical to Princeton? Thinking that Princeton was far enough away that people wouldn't notice.
I thought it was Robert Brookings' idea. He went to visit, I think, and he came away. You know, he was nothing if not stubborn. And once he had an idea in his head, you know, especially since he was the one with the money, it was going to happen. My sense was that it was his idea, but what do you think, Esley?
I think he liked it so much, he forced the other architect to confirm to Cass Gilbert's plan, but Gilbert's plan was Asher limestone for buildings, and I think that would have been awful.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the other ones were all white. And so this was the only one that used red Missouri granite. And red Missouri granite had been used somewhat before this, but not extensively. Usually it was used for foundation stones rather than the main part of the building prior to this.
The color of the granite was controversial later on because in the post-World War II era, Arthur Holly Compton, who was the chancellor, hired a man who had been accused falsely of being involved with Russians. It was McCarthy era and people were under suspicion. And this man was under suspicion and it wasn't justified. But anyway, there were people who were very unhappy that this man had come to the university and they called it the Pinko University because of the pink granite.
It sounds like that era.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to say also that the house of David R. Francis has been torn down, but the grounds are still pretty much intact. It was built in the block just north of the cathedral, the new cathedral at Maryland and Newstead. And the grounds were laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted. The wall around the site was designed by Isaac Taylor, who was the chief architect of the fair also. And the wall and the landscaping are still there, but the building in the middle was built as a convent and now as other archdiocesan functions. But it's really the only Olmsted Senior landscape in St. Louis.
We also talked about William Eames, who was a graduate of the university and who was involved with the fair. He also designed some early medical buildings too in St. Louis, but he proposed a plan for the new campus too. One of the renderings that's in the WashU book that I did is the William Eames plan for what WashU would look like.
Yeah,
it's
also Brookings house that you showed and the David R. Francis house that you showed.
Yeah, that I didn't know. Great, that's great.
David, since we're on the topic of the mansions and stuff that Esley's been talking to so well, do you see the question from Perrin?
I don't see that. I do see a question from Diane, though, about whether the Bixby Mansion on Portland Place is still around.
That's an excellent question, and I don't know the answer. Esley, do you?
It's actually on the cover of the book about Portland and Westmoreland places.
Oh.
Okay.
So the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and go ahead, David.
Oh, I see now. I see. Yeah, I guess the question was, are there any more photos available of David R. Francis' interior of his mansion?
Oh, that I don't know. The ones of Bixby's are easy to come by, but I don't know about Francis. Esley,
Yeah,
what do you think?
I've never seen any. The building did have a dome, a shallow dome that doesn't show in a lot of pictures, but there are a few pictures that do show it.
Okay. Huh. Well, I don't know. I'll see if I can find that.
Okay, while you're looking for that, Candace, let me ask you and our expert architect history of St. Louis County. And for those who don't know, Esley Hamilton, that was an official position, wasn't it, Esley, of the county historian you held for a long time?
Right.
Okay. With
That's
all
why-
the building that WashU has done in the last 15 or 20 years between the South 40 being built up to where there's hardly any more room, and then the re-architecting of the portion between the quadrangle where the big trees used to be and the Forest Park, their front door, so to speak, that for, probably 2 years, it looked like they were building an Indian mound or monk's mound when they scraped up all the dirt for the underground garage. They put that back together. They filled up just about all this footage that they could with new buildings. Do you think that all these new buildings, Esley and Candace, fit in well following the original style of WashU?
Well, I would say that there are only a few of them that show the skill using the style that that Cope and Stewardson and James Jameson were able to achieve. And the one at the corner of Skinker and Forest Park is probably the worst. That tower is just a disgrace.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I wondered, it was surprising to me that they didn't ask anybody to review those designs. It was only the administrative staff that looked at them and before they were approved.
Oh my.
There are some other buildings that are nicer though. I think the one, I don't know what it's called now. It used to be called the Psychology Building on a kind of midway along Forsyth. That has an absolutely stunning tower.
Well, speaking of towers or domes, Esley, you were right. You can see the dome there on this house of David Francis. Yeah, you can just see a little bit of it.
Yeah.
As far as your question goes, Mike, I'm not really in a position to criticize or praise architecture. I don't know enough about it, but I will say that the former Chancellor Mark Wrighton was known for wanting to construct as many buildings as possible, and I have a funny story about that. That one time we were at a dinner and his wife was there too, and you know, people were talking about all the new buildings going up, and someone mentioned the garden that the women's club maintains in honor of Ibby Danforth, and it's a very pretty large garden, and as soon as Risa heard them mention that, Risa Wright, and she said, "Well, at least that's one place where Mark can't put a building."
Well, if we're up for one more funny story, about 7-8 years ago, I was driving along Skinker going north, and I looked to the right expecting to see Francis Gymnasium, you know, with the old brickworks all the way around close to Skinker, and the gymnasium was gone. And I went, what the heck? And I found out what their plans were to, and I think we had a WashU person come out and tell us that they're going to keep the front facade, which they did with the two towers of Washington Gymnasium, Francis Gymnasium.
Francis.
But the problem is that between the front part and the gymnasium part, required stairs, the elevators were way too small. It didn't meet handicap standards, and they had money and they wanted to expand the facility into a large fitness center, which they did to befit a university of their stature. And the first time I had heard about that was when it was, you know, 80% a done deal, and there was nothing we could do except express kind of shock. And I guess my personal opinion is it could have been worse. At least they left the facade there.
Mhm.
You know, there's a tribute to the World's Fair by leaving that facade. It still kind of looks like Francis Gym.
Well, it was a great controversy when they tore down Prince Hall, which was the one building that you know, from the original bunch that has disappeared. Esley, I don't know which side of that I can suspect which side you were on, but I don't remember.
Yeah, comments, Esley?
I did. I wrote the original National Historic Landmark nomination for the campus at Washington University. So when those two buildings were torn down, the National Park Service called me and told me I would have to resubmit an amended nomination, removing those two buildings from the district. And I said, my responsibility ended with the submitting of the original nomination. And if they wanted to change it, they'd have to do it themselves.
That's telling them.
Okay, any other questions that have shown up? I've seen a couple of comments, one from Jana Meehan, that they loved Larry said the construction photos were remarkable. Jana Meehan said, I really enjoyed this. My brain is stuffed. Thank you so much. From Gene O'Malley, thank you so much. So any last questions? If you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and ask away before we proceed with the closing part of the meeting.
I wanted to mention the gateway to Francis Field, which is actually a memorial to the fair, built 10 years after the fair. And I think that was another one of the things that was done with the money left from the fair.
Yes, it was. It states that on one of the two big metal plaques that are on the pillars, that it was paid for by the LPE company, which made it a fourth item that they paid for besides the History Museum,
World's
doing the
Fair
statue
Pavilion. Yeah,
and the World's Fair Pavilion.
Pavilion.
They also put that gateway up. And of course, 2 years ago, they had to rename it because it is now Francis Olympic Field.
Oh,
Ah,
I didn't know that.
ah.
Yep. And have you seen the big Olympic rings that are there? You can drive up the parking lot there by the gate and see these enormous Olympic rings that are just very impressive. That
Oh, my.
you have to have IOC permission to put things like that up, and only Olympic sites can do that.
Wow.
They're beautiful. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll wrap this thing up in the next 4 or 5 minutes here. First, I want to, thank Candace for doing this and putting up with me, and for putting up with my help and support, and the time that she spent doing this. It's our
Oh,
tradition to present. Candace, if you stop your share, your screen share, the red button.
Yep.
There we go. And if everybody wants to go into the view speaker view, that way, as I'm talking, I'm probably the big person there. Candace, it's our tradition in the World's Fair Society to give first-time presenters a special memento of, their presentation. And we have here, oh, I can't see myself, so I hope I'm holding this up in about the right spot. Somebody give me a thumbs up if I've got it in the right spot here to see. Thank you, Al and Sharon. This is a paperweight with the World's Fair Society logo on it.
Oh, how nice. Thank you very much. That's
And
very
I will
kind.
either be bringing it to you or mailing it to you here in the next week.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it and I appreciate that.
Well, I had fun doing it with you, and I learned a lot too, as I'm sure we all did.
Mike, can you hear us? Can we say something?
Sure.
Out here in the hinterlands, Bob and I wanted to tell our speaker how much we enjoyed it. And we just thought this was a wonderful program, and we're glad that we could hear it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Was that you talking, Sharon? You just see your little thumbnail.
No, it's Bobby.
Oh, Bobby. Okay. Great. That's all the way from Jefferson City from a couple of charter members, Candace.
Oh, nice.
Mike,
Yes.
Mike, I have just a funny story. My dad graduated from Washington U, and so he wanted to go back to an anniversary. Well, he graduated in like 1929. And so Mary Wicks and Charles Eames, were famous people in his class. But anyway, so we went to the big anniversary, and there we were. And this girl, young student, said to my dad, "Was the parking as terrible when you went to school as now?" And he said, "Honey, nobody had a car." And she said, "But what about the faculty?" He said, "They rode the streetcars too."
Yeah, that's for sure. It was the streetcar school. It was known as the streetcar school back then. That's cute.
Okay. I've got a quick update for those of you who want to take notes. This information will appear and is subject to change, of course, but it'll appear in our bulletin about a month from now on Thursday, June 17th. At 7 p.m., Holly Childress and myself will present a new presentation of a trip on the Pike, and that'll be by Zoom. And remember, the date for the June meeting is Thursday, June 17th. In July, we're planning to have a presentation about the Olympics, since the delayed Olympics are scheduled to be held. The date is still being firmed up, but I'm looking at Wednesday, July 14th, subject to change. I firmed up a speaker for Wednesday, August 11th. We'll have a new presentation about the Swedish Pavilion and Sweden at the World's Fair. And that will be by a person who is part of the Historical Association that is caring for that out in Lindsborg, Kansas now. And the last one on our calendar that I can firm up, hopefully, is, or that I can state is firm. I've made a reservation, I think I mentioned this last month, for Saturday, September 11th in Forest Park, picnic area number 11. We'll have our annual picnic. And everybody knock on wood. It'll be in person. And that's our favorite secluded picnic area in Forest Park. I promise you that we'll have great food and desserts, a fun game and activity, excellent fellowship, and great weather. Wait. Well, I can promise the first three, but I'm not so sure at the weather. We have to keep our fingers crossed. So be sure and save the date, Saturday, September 11th. Last call for anybody that has any inputs, compliments, questions, or whatever. Because at this point, I want to I'll give that 5 seconds for anyone to speak up.
Yes, can you hear me, Mike? Mark,
Yes, Mark, go ahead. Whoops, I saw your mouth moving, but couldn't hear you, Mark.
can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, you were making reference to the street in front of Brookings Hall. You knew it was too close to the building to be Skinker Boulevard.
Mhm.
And what that was Hoyt Drive. I don't think it's there now. I think it was removed in recent years for new construction. I consulted William Magnum's book, Streets of St. Louis, that he came out with several years ago, the former postal delivery boy, and makes no mention of it in that book. So I don't know if there's any mention of it in the book we talked about tonight. They maybe haven't looked at the index, but it was
Okay.
Hoyt Drive, H-O-Y-T. Who it was named
Okay.
for, I don't know.
It was named for the first chancellor of the university, who died very young.
Ah, thank you.
More information. One last piece of information that I need to correct myself that an hour or so ago when I said check our Facebook page, follow our Instagram page. We have an Instagram page that Holly puts pictures on. We do not have a Twitter page. And as I get older and older, had a birthday this past week, those two tends to just sometimes get mixed up in my brain, I guess. So with that, I want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you for the questions, and a big thank you to Candace for putting this together and helping me learn a little bit about a Mac and how to make it save a PowerPoint presentation so we could work on it together.
Yes, thank you, Mike. That was
Oh, thank you.
incredibly important.
Candace, us Mac people are the best, aren't we?
Oh, well, yes, except when whenever the rest of the world is not Mac, but yes.
I'm a Mac person.
And Yvonne, there she is.
Yep.
Okay, well, I'm showing a few people are leaving. If anybody wants to, the chat room is now open. I'm going to stop recording and you can pass things on. And Jana, since I've got the microphone right now, for your information, I have her slides and I can give you any slides you want. And I also have most of her script, so I can, answer any questions you have for the bulletin.
Outstanding. Thank you very much. And I will be calling on you for photography.
Okay, we can do that.
See you later.
Okay. Questions, inputs, dialogue?